It begins in a place the avoidant once understood very well: the space between distance and control. For a long time, your reactions followed a pattern they could predict. When they pulled away, you leaned in. When they went quiet, you filled the silence. Not because you were weak, but because you were emotionally invested. You cared, and your care expressed itself through pursuit, reassurance, and presence. To the avoidant, this created a quiet sense of certainty, not necessarily security, but control. They didn't have to fully engage with their own emotional depth because your energy compensated for it. Your consistency allowed them to remain inconsistent. Your openness allowed them to remain guarded. And over time, without even realizing it, they began to assume that no matter how distant they became, you would always close the gap. But then something changed, and this is where the psychology becomes important. You stopped reacting. Not out of anger, not out of strategy, but out of awareness. You began to recognize that constantly reaching for someone who withdraws isn't connection, it's imbalance. And instead of trying to fix that imbalance externally, you corrected it internally. You paused, you reflected, and most importantly, you chose not to abandon yourself just to maintain access to them. From the outside, it looked like silence, but this silence was not passive. It was not empty. It was deeply intentional. And for the avoidant, it was disorienting. Because for the first time, the familiar emotional rhythm was interrupted. The space they created no longer triggered your pursuit. The distance they relied on no longer gave them relief, it gave them uncertainty. And uncertainty is something the avoidant mind struggles with profoundly because it removes the illusion of control. Your silence forced a confrontation not with you, but within them. Without your constant presence filling the emotional gaps, they were left alone with their own thoughts, and what they began to notice was unsettling. The absence of your energy wasn't peaceful. It wasn't neutral. It was loud in a way they didn't expect. Because when someone who once responded with warmth, patience, and effort suddenly becomes still, it creates a psychological vacuum. And that vacuum demands interpretation. They begin to ask questions they never had to ask before. Why aren't you reaching out? Why aren't you reacting? Have you moved on? Have you changed? And underneath all of those questions sits a deeper one they may not even consciously articulate. Have they lost their influence over you? This is where your power quietly emerges. Not in dominance, not in control, but in your refusal to participate in a dynamic that diminishes you. Your silence becomes a boundary rather than a tactic. It communicates something far more profound than words ever could: that your presence is no longer guaranteed, and your energy is no longer negotiable. And here's the paradox. The less you try to be understood, the more they attempt to understand you. Because unpredictability disrupts emotional complacency. When they could predict you, they didn't have to study you. Now they do. Now every absence carries meaning. Every moment of stillness becomes something they analyze. And in that analysis, they begin to feel something unfamiliar: vulnerability. Not the vulnerability of expression, but the vulnerability of not knowing. You are no longer operating within the emotional framework they built. You've stepped outside of it. And when someone can no longer place you within their expectations, they experience a loss of psychological footing. They can't anticipate your next move. They can't rely on your old responses. And that unpredictability forces them into a position they've spent a lifetime avoiding: emotional exposure. What makes this transformation even more significant is that you didn't become unpredictable by changing who you are. You became unpredictable by becoming more aligned with yourself. By no longer overextending, overexplaining, or overcompensating, you removed the patterns that once made you easy to navigate. And now they're navigating you differently, carefully, uncertainly, sometimes even anxiously. Because your silence carries a message they can no longer ignore: that you are capable of detaching, of choosing peace over pursuit, of walking away without needing closure from them. And that realization doesn't just confuse them, it unsettles them. Because for the first time, they're not managing the distance. They're experiencing it. And once that distance is no longer something they control, something even more destabilizing begins to unfold. Because what you disrupted wasn't just a moment or a reaction, it was a pattern. A deeply ingrained emotional sequence they had come to rely on, often without conscious awareness. Avoided dynamics are rarely random. They follow a quiet, repetitive structure. There is closeness, then discomfort. There is connection, then withdrawal. And in that withdrawal, there is usually an unspoken expectation that you will move toward them, restore the balance. and reestablish emotional safety on their terms. It's a cycle that allows them to experience connection without ever fully surrendering to it. For a long time, you participated in that cycle. Not because you lacked awareness, but because you valued the connection. You believed, as many do, that consistency and patience would eventually create stability. So when they pulled away, you reached in. When they created space, you tried to close it. And in doing so, you unknowingly reinforced the very pattern that kept you emotionally off-center. But disruption doesn't begin with confrontation. It begins with recognition. At some point, you saw the pattern for what it was: not a temporary phase, not a misunderstanding, but a structure. A loop that could continue indefinitely unless something fundamentally changed. And instead of trying to change them, within that loop, you made a different decision. You stepped out of it. You didn't chase. And that single shift carries more psychological weight than most people realize. Because when you stop chasing, you remove the mechanism that keeps the cycle alive. The avoidant can no longer rely on your emotional pursuit to bring things back into alignment. The distance they create no longer guarantees reconnection. And without that guarantee, the entire structure begins to destabilize. This is where their internal experience becomes complex. At first, there may be a sense of relief. Space, after all, is what they've always gravitated toward. But that relief is short-lived because something essential is missing: the return, the reassurance. The quiet confirmation that despite their withdrawal, they are still desired, still chosen, still central to your emotional world. When that confirmation doesn't come, confusion sets in. And confusion, for someone accustomed to predictable outcomes, is deeply unsettling. They begin to revisit the sequence in their mind. You were always there before. You always responded. You always reached back. So why not now? What changed? And more importantly, what does that change mean? This is where your power becomes visible not through action, but through absence. You are no longer reinforcing the narrative that their behavior has no consequences. You are no longer participating in a dynamic where your emotional availability compensates for their emotional distance. Instead, you are allowing the pattern to collapse under its own weight. And when a pattern collapses, it forces awareness. They start to see the connection differently. Not as something that will always be there, but as something that required your participation to survive. Your effort, your willingness, your presence. And without those elements, what remains is not stability, but fragility. This realization introduces something unfamiliar into their internal world: accountability. Not in a confrontational sense, not as blame, but as recognition. Recognition that the dynamic they relied on was not self-sustaining. It was co-created. And now that you've withdrawn your role in that creation, they are left facing a version of the connection that feels incomplete. And here is the deeper psychological shift: they begin to see you differently. Before, you were predictable, reliable in a way that made you emotionally accessible, but also in their perception, somewhat fixed. Someone who would adapt, adjust, and remain, regardless of inconsistency. But now, you exist outside of that expectation. You are no longer responding in ways that confirm their assumptions. And when someone no longer fits the role you assign them, they become difficult to categorize. That difficulty creates a tension. They start to think about you more, not less. They analyze your silence, your absence, your change in behavior. And in that analysis, they begin to recognize something they hadn't fully acknowledged before: that your presence was not guaranteed. It was a choice, one you made repeatedly. And now, it's a choice you're no longer making in the same way. That's what disrupts them most. Not just that you stopped chasing, but that you revealed the possibility that you could stop entirely. That you could exist without needing to re-enter the cycle. That you could choose a different emotional reality, one that doesn't depend on their readiness or their patterns. And that realization shifts the balance in a way they cannot easily regain. Because the cycle only works when both people play their part. And you don't anymore. Which means what once felt permanent now feels uncertain. What once felt controlled now feels exposed. And what once felt predictable now feels completely out of reach. You didn't break the pattern by forcing change. You broke it by no longer agreeing to repeat it. And in doing so, you didn't just change the dynamic. You changed the terms of your presence entirely. And once someone realizes you are no longer willing to return to what diminished you, they are left with a truth that is impossible to ignore: the pattern didn't end because it couldn't continue. It ended because you chose not to. And when a pattern ends, it doesn't just create distance between two people, it creates space. Space that, whether intentionally or not, becomes a catalyst for growth. What you chose to do with that space is what truly altered the dynamic in a way the avoidant didn't anticipate. Because while they continued relying on distance as a form of emotional regulation, you began using distance as a tool for self-examination. You didn't just step back from them, you stepped deeper into yourself. This is where the shift becomes less visible on the surface, but far more profound psychologically. You started asking different questions, not how do I get them back, but why did I accept so little? Not what are they feeling, but what am I tolerating? And in that shift of focus, your entire emotional orientation began to change. Growth, in this sense, is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It happens quietly, through awareness, through boundaries, through the gradual decision to no longer override your own needs for the sake of maintaining connection. And what's important to understand is that this kind of growth is stabilizing. It grounds you. It makes your behavior more consistent, your emotions more regulated, your decisions more intentional. You're no longer reacting from fear of loss or responding from clarity. To the avoidant, this is unfamiliar territory, because their internal world often depends on minimizing emotional intensity, avoiding vulnerability, and maintaining a sense of independence that keeps deeper connection at a distance. While you were moving toward emotional integration, they were maintaining emotional avoidance. And for a time, that difference wasn't fully visible because your efforts bridged the gap. But now, without your effort compensating for their distance, the contrast becomes clear. They begin to notice that you are no longer seeking the same reassurances. You're no longer trying to decode their behavior or earn their consistency. There is a calmness in you that wasn't there before, a kind of emotional self-sufficiency that doesn't require their participation to feel complete. And that's where the discomfort begins for them, because your growth doesn't just change how you show up, it changes what you accept. The behaviors that once felt tolerable to you no longer align with your sense of self. The ambiguity, the inconsistency, the emotional unavailability, these are no longer things you try to navigate. They are things you recognize and, if necessary, walk away from. This creates a kind of silent pressure. Not because you are demanding anything from them, but because your very presence now reflects a standard they are not meeting. And that reflection is difficult to ignore. It forces them, even if unconsciously, to confront aspects of themselves they've long avoided. Your clarity highlights their confusion. Your consistency highlights their inconsistency. Your willingness to face your emotions highlights their tendency to suppress theirs. And this is where the psychological tension deepens, because your growth introduces a mirror they didn't ask to look into. For someone who has built their sense of stability around avoiding emotional depth, being faced with that depth, especially through someone they once felt comfortable with, can be unsettling. It creates a kind of internal contradiction. On one hand, they may feel drawn to the groundedness you now embody. On the other, they may feel exposed by it. Because growth has changed the way you relate, not just to them, but to yourself. You are no longer negotiating your worth in the context of their behavior. You are no longer measuring your value by their availability. And that shift removes the leverage there. Distance once had over you. They can feel that. Even if they can't fully articulate it, they sense that something fundamental has changed. The connection no longer operates on the same terms. You are not reaching for them in the same way. You are not waiting in the same way. And most importantly, you are not needing in the same way. That absence of need is often misinterpreted as detachment, but in reality, it's alignment. You're still capable of connection, still open to closeness, but not at the expense of your own emotional stability. And that distinction matters because it means your presence is no longer driven by attachment, it's driven by choice. And when someone realizes that your connection to them is a choice rather than a necessity, it changes how they perceive you entirely. You are no longer someone they can return to without reflection. You are someone they must meet at a different level to access. And that level requires something they may not yet have developed emotionally: accountability, consistency, and the willingness to engage without retreating. This is the moment where your growth becomes undeniable to them, not because you told them, not because you explained it, but because it's reflected in everything you no longer do. The silence, the boundaries, the restraint, these are not signs of absence. They are signs of evolution. And evolution, by its nature, creates distance from what no longer fits. You didn't outgrow them out of superiority. You outgrew the dynamic out of self-respect. And when someone is faced with the realization that your growth has made the old version of the connection impossible to return to, They are left with a truth that is both simple and difficult to accept. You didn't just move forward, you moved beyond where they chose to remain. And when you move beyond where they chose to remain, something begins to register on a level they can no longer ignore. It's subtle at first. Not an immediate realization, not a dramatic shift, but a quiet awareness that something familiar is no longer accessible in the same way. They start to feel you differently. Not because you've made a declaration, not because you've created distance in an obvious or confrontational sense, but because your energy is no longer reaching toward them. It's no longer extending, no longer waiting, no longer holding space in the way it once did. And for someone who became accustomed to your emotional availability, that shift is deeply disorienting, because what they're experiencing now is not the distance they created. It's the distance they can't control. There's a fundamental psychological difference between the two. When they withdrew in the past, there was always an underlying assumption, whether conscious or not, that they could return. That your presence would still be there, intact, receptive, and willing to re-engage. That assumption created a kind of emotional safety net. It allowed them to leave without fully confronting the consequences of leaving. But now, that safety net feels unstable. Not because you've taken anything from them, but because you've stopped offering something they once relied on: certainty. And uncertainty introduces a form of tension they are not used to navigating. They begin to notice the absence in moments that used to feel predictable, the lack of a message, the absence of a reaction, the quiet consistency of your distance. And over time, those moments accumulate into a realization that is difficult to dismiss. You are no longer emotionally within reach in the way you once were. This is where the internal conflict intensifies. Part of them may still default to avoidance, to minimizing the significance of the shift, to telling themselves that space is normal, that distance is preferable. But another part, often less familiar, less practiced, begins to feel something else entirely: loss. Not necessarily the loss of you as a person, but the loss of access, the loss of influence, the loss of a dynamic that once allowed them to engage on their own terms without risking too much of themselves. And what makes this loss particularly complex is that it doesn't come from rejection. It comes from your withdrawal of availability. You didn't push them away. You stopped holding the door open. And that distinction matters because it removes the narrative that they were forced out. Instead, it places them in a position where they must consider the possibility that they are no longer being invited in. That's a difficult position for someone who is used to maintaining emotional distance, because it requires them to confront something they've spent a long time avoiding: initiative. If they want to reconnect, they can't rely on you to initiate it. If they want to understand you, they can't rely on you to explain yourself. If they want access to you again, they may have to move toward you in a way that feels unfamiliar, vulnerable, and uncertain. And that's where the fear begins to surface. Not always consciously, not always in a way they can articulate, but it's there in the hesitation, in the second guessing, in the quiet recognition that they may no longer have the same place in your life. Because for the first time, the roles have shifted. You are no longer the one waiting. They are no longer the ones deciding. And in that shift, the balance of emotional power changes. But it's important to understand that this isn't power in the traditional sense. It's not about control, manipulation, or gaining the upper hand. It's about self-possession. It's about no longer outsourcing your emotional stability to someone who couldn't consistently meet you where you were. Your distance is not a reaction to them. It's a commitment to yourself. And that commitment creates a kind of finality, not necessarily in the sense that the connection is over, but in the sense that it cannot return to what it once was. They can feel that. Even if there are no words, no closure, no explicit ending, there is a shift in the emotional landscape that makes the past version of the relationship inaccessible. And when someone realizes that they